So, today I want to talk about revolution from the perspective of leftists, and more specifically from the perspective of anarchists. When most people think of the word revolution, they have a tendency to assume that we're talking about the idea of a group of people rising up and overthrowing one system of power, usually a government or other institution, and exchanging that for another form of power or institution. Or in the case of anarchy, the absence of a power or institution in favor of, say, direct democracy or some other mutual system that works for them. I'm not talking about that type of violent overthrow today. For me, revolution is not just represented as that violent overthrow. It's a philosophical perspective that refers to a change in status, mind, and societal behavior. It's a descriptor of the changes in behavior of individuals and people as a concept rather than that of a specific overthrow of a power structure or government. I like to think of and point out the examples of the agricultural revolution or the industrial revolution, where a shift in technology and social status and behavior influenced and changed the way an entire society was functioning. You had a huge shift from the Industrial Revolution from people making products a certain way into making them another way. It changed the entire distribution model of the society. It changed the concept of class consciousness. It changed everything over a very short period of time. And while historians will often bicker about when something like that started, especially when you're talking about something like an idea or, a concept that ends up changing and influencing a society, there is a tangible change that occurs. And so, before I get into the anarchist perspective on all of this, I want to talk about another key example that's often misrepresented in history: the United States Revolution, the American Revolution. The understanding that most people have is that the American Revolution is the struggle that started in 1775 at Concord and Lexington, where the first bullets were fired, or perhaps some people would argue in 1776 when the Declaration of Independence was signed. And from those moments forward into 1783, we define that as the American Revolution. However, there's a number of historians and philosophers who would argue that the American Revolution was not that struggle, that was what's known as the American War of Independence, and that the American Revolution actually started as early as 1763. Some historians would probably argue a little bit earlier, but generally speaking, the end of the French and Indian War is a good marker for that, where the change in perspective of the British Empire towards the 13 colonies ends up creating a sense of unique identity within the colonies themselves, where instead of the subjects of the British Crown thinking of themselves as subjects of the British Crown, as citizens of the British Empire, they started to think of themselves as a unique entity in and of themselves. And this was probably a process that started way before, but the writings of people like Thomas Paine, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and many, many more come out in this time period and influence and change the perspective to show that most citizens had some sort of shift in perspective. Those that remained loyalists often were people not affected by this change, and that was kind of the big conflict that occurred between loyalists and those who started seeing this very new, brand new perspective of seeing themselves with an American identity. And while the American Revolution has all of its complexities to it, and, there's a lot more philosophically there, in general, we can think of that concept of it being a philosophical shift from recognizing one as an Englishman into that of an American or a colonial representing your specific colony. And so when I look at this from the perspective of anarchy, I like to think of the revolution not as the moment that we overthrow whatever systems of government and whatever systems of capitalism that we want to take out. What I think of it as is a constant evolving process that involves the change in mind and perspective. I've actually heard people make the argument that we are somehow better off and we radicalize more under conservative regimes rather than under more left-leaning regimes, and that I've also heard perspectives that we function better as we get closer and closer to fascism to radicalize people to our perspectives. I would argue that one, history has shown quite the opposite, but two, I would argue that that actually has us on a defensive position where violence is often a means that we have to use quite against our own principles in order to stop fascism. Bash the fash is a great catchphrase, and it brings us to a position where yes, we do have to stop fascism because at the end of the day, it is the complete antithesis of our principles and is completely authoritarian and harms people, greatly. But that, again, I argue would be a defensive position. The minute we're in that mode, we are in a position where we're trying to defend the most basic principles of who we are. Who we are as anarchists and leftists are people who want to see a change in perspective in society, and that is much more available and widely accepted from us in situations when you have a much further left-leaning government in place than fascism. Even neoliberalism, I would argue, as much as people would like to disagree with that. So, what do I mean by this? Well, I mean that we're able to start focusing on things like mutual aid networks. We're able to start focusing on creating structures and systems of dual power. We're able to focus on tasks like feeding children, making sure that there's some sort of mutual childcare networks, making sure that children are getting the best education possible. We can focus on these type of institutions when we don't have our backs to the wall. And so I want to talk about the revolution of the mind that comes from not having our backs to that proverbial wall, with fascism right at the cusp of reality. Basically, we need to start focusing on the shift in our minds from being individuals, specifically just individuals with our own selfish, capitalist-oriented perspectives, and start examining the world again from the idea that when our neighbor has a struggle or problem, that is our struggle and problem. When they are suffering, we are suffering. That we need to come together and band together and think of our struggles as a unified movement. And that change in perspective, that change in mindset, the overcoming of the fears of trust that have been ingrained in us through capitalism and through the social structures of what they are, to trust our neighbors again, especially people who live in cities, who have often been placed in situations where you often don't think of your neighbors necessarily as friends and allies, but as rivals for positions in workplaces, as rivals in positions for space and time and energy and everything else, especially as cramped as many cities are. The idea that we want to come out in favor of our neighbors and speak on their behalf and work towards the same type of goals of making sure everybody owns their property and is housed, of making sure that everybody has proper medication and is able to get access to that, whether that's making sure that food is available and establishing and running food pantries, whether that means creating alternative workplaces with some sort of, democratically owned co-op based system, whether that means creating, these type of financial institutions like either a bank or some sort of credit union that allows for local purchasing and bulk purchasing of products, and making sure people are able to take over their homes and properties. These are the type of things that we need to revolutionize ourselves with and think about the needs of community, the needs of the people around us, and start forming those ties and connections. That to me is a much more revolutionary process, a much more gradual shift towards anarchism than the idea of bashing the fash in the street, or even that violent overthrow that may or may not come at the end of the day. We need to shift our perspectives. We need to bring ourselves to this idea of communal thinking, of mutualism, where we have popular assemblies, where people go out and they see a problem and they just handle it themselves. I made a video talking about, this one group in Malaysia that basically came out and just started repairing roads. We need systems like that where we show a majority of people that we don't need the state, that we don't need capitalism to be at our best, and that we actually function quite beyond that position. That with the tools that we have at our disposal, the internet, the ability to collectively organize, the fact that we have literally a library in our hands at all times for those of us who own phones, that we can look up on YouTube or some other institution any sort of guide, how to do system, that we can message each other in an instant and come to some sort of mutual understanding, tells me that we're already on this revolutionary path of thinking of ourselves quite differently as a society. That we don't need to be just cogs in the machine, individuals scrounging for individual scraps, competing over jobs, and being forced to work against each other at all turns. And as we start to develop this change in perspective and see each other's problems as part of a larger whole, when we start to come to the aid of people because they need childcare, they need some sort of place or way to maintain their food and workplace, and everything else that I've mentioned. When we start focusing the priority of other people at the same level as our own and unify in that way, we create this revolution not just of our own internal mindset of feeling less lonely, less stuck in our positions, but a revolution in other people and how they see each other and the world around us. That is what we should be striving for as anarchists, to come to this new position, this new philosophical understanding of developing ourselves, of developing the human spirit, of recognizing change and growth in people. That's why when I see positions like people coming out with new gender identities, in the non-binary spectrum of things, when I see people pushing the boundary of the human existence, than what we thought was possible, before as a collective society, and being in all sorts of new thought processes. That's something that we should be embracing. Whenever we can push beyond the understanding of what we have and get rid of restrictions that have been placed on us from other systems and forms of oppression, we should be seeking that out. We should be asking ourselves, how can I understand my fellow human being more? Even if we're flawed in it at first. That's part of a revolution. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to grow from all this. That's part of the process. And so when we do this, we need to come out and support each other as best as possible, learn to understand each other as best as possible, explore that human condition and that very essence of what makes a human being a human being. Be the best that we can be. And let the systems of violence and oppression, when they oppose us, be the systems that they want to be. And we'll stand up to them when we have to, and when they stand in our way from being better and making ourselves greater. That is when we push back. And if at the end of that it leads to some sort of violent overthrow or system in that case, where we have to use that as a last push to get through the birthing process into a new stage in humanity, then so be it. But until that point, we should be focusing on the revolution of the mind, of bringing ourselves into new perspectives and understandings. With that said, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter. Check out my Discord in the description down below. We have an awesome community there. Definitely would love to have you. With that said, my name is Anarchist Tara, and I hope you enjoyed watching.